Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2010, U.S. Introductory Survey to 1877. In this video, we're going to talk about the American Revolution, or more correctly, we're going to discuss the Revolution before the Revolution, encompassing the years leading up to the beginning of the Anglo-American colonies' armed independence struggle against Great Britain, roughly from 1765 to 1774, with some background information before these years. We will discuss the grievances that the American colonists had against the metropole, their mother country. We will also consider long-term social and cultural trends that helped to inspire this anti-imperial struggle, ultimately leading to war between Great Britain and the American colonies. For decades in English colonial history, two major socio-cultural trends were at work in the colonies. These trends are called Anglicization and Americanization. Anglicization was a cultural shift in the Anglo-American colonies that saw the colonists begin to develop more positive feelings for England, English culture, and the British Empire as a whole. The primary drivers of Anglicization were political events like the Glorious Revolution, which saw Catholic King James II replaced by Protestant King William and Queen Mary, as well as military conflicts in which the American colonists fought England's imperial enemies, as seen, for example, during the French Indian Wars. In our discussion of the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary's takeover of the British Isles, we have to talk about the English Bill of Rights. It's a very important development in the Glorious Revolution, and it would have major significance for the American colonists as well. And there will most certainly be questions about the English Bill of Rights on the Florida Civic Literacy exam. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights is drafted. It's based on Enlightenment principles, most notably John Locke's idea of the consent of the governed. The English Bill of Rights lays out Parliament's right to assembly. Parliament had been meeting for many years before this, but sometimes the kings of England would try to shut down Parliament and keep it from meeting. This document will give Parliament the right to assemble and to meet, and basically to have a petition for redress of grievances. If there's a disagreement between the English people and the king, that disagreement will go through Parliament and be presented to the ruler. Other provisions for the English Bill of Rights relate to civil rights. They include things like a right to bear arms for all Protestants, and also things like no quartering of troops in the British Isles. This was very important because quartering was seen as being something that went against English common law, and the Anglo-American colonists are also going to really come to oppose quartering as well of British troops in their colony, which you're going to see later in this video. Parliament also had a right to the freedom of speech under the English Bill of Rights. That's a part of their redress of grievances. Parliament also will have to play a role in taxation. There can be no taxation without the consent of Parliament. The Parliament actually, being an elected body, not every English person can vote at this point in history, but there is a democratic process for the nomination of members of Parliament. And these rights are protected as being the rights of Englishmen. And the Bill of Rights in England will inspire the U.S. Bill of Rights about 100 years later, and also Anglo-American colonists would have been aware of this Bill of Rights, particularly its provisions about no quartering, no taxation without representation, petition of redress of grievances, and they would have demanded those rights as Englishmen and as British subjects, even as they themselves were becoming more American. And the images on this slide are of William and Mary being presented with the English Bill of Rights, and then a close-up of the actual text of the English Bill of Rights. Along with the Glorious Revolution, the Anglo-American colonists became closer with the English and British Empire because of the French and Indian Wars. There were several of them, as you remember from a previous lecture, but these wars gave the British Empire and the Anglo-American colonists a common cause as they're fighting against France, an old enemy. France is also Catholic. The French are also closer with Native Americans than the Anglo-American colonists too. So the French are an ideal enemy for the British Empire and for the Anglo-American colonists to fight. Simultaneously, though, the French and Indian War, the last one, the really big one that's also known as the 7 Years' War, it also works to tear the Anglo-American colonists and the British Empire apart. In 1763, the British Empire had the Proclamation Line that forbade the Anglo-American colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. While the British Empire did walk back the Proclamation Line and open up some of that land for further settlement, they were still trying to restrict the American colonists from settling out west, not allowing them to move out there as fast as the colonists wanted to move out there. And British troops were quartered in the colonies even after the war ended. Those British soldiers had been called up to fight during the war, and they could not be quartered back in England according to the English Bill of Rights. But it's a different matter in the English American or Anglo American colonies. And of course, taxes are going to have to be increased to pay for this very expensive war, to pay the salaries of these troops. So these former allies, the British Empire and the Anglo American colonists, at one point they were being brought together by these wars, but now these wars, particularly the last French and Indian War, is really tearing them apart. And there's other trends of Anglicization and Americanization as well, where there's things that could be bringing the Anglo-American colonists and the British Empire together, but even as they're being brought together, they're being torn apart. And you're going to see some more examples of that. So the trend of Anglicization, by which the Anglo-American colonists became more English, in some ways brought the colonists closer with the English or British Empire, but it also divided them at the same time. It encouraged the Anglo-American colonists to call for their rights as Englishmen and their rights as British subjects, which put them into conflict with the British Empire. They also were buying more goods from the British Empire, as you're going to see, and if they're not being charged fair prices or they're being made to pay taxes on those goods, they're going to become very upset, as you're going to see. The trend of Americanization, though, I think it serves almost exclusively to divide the Anglo-American colonists from the English and from the British. What I mean by Americanization is, as they're living in America multiple generations by the 18th century, they're becoming American. They're living their lives differently. Their standard of living is different than the standard of living in the British Isles. And you really see this in the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening, it democratizes Christianity. It leads to the growth of newer Christian sects or newer Christian denominations. It encourages religious tolerance for all Protestant sects. Catholics, etc., are not really included in this religious tolerance. And the First Great Awakening, it questions old religious power structures. It questions the Anglican or Church of England. It questions older churches like the Puritans as well. And it really leads to future generations beginning to question political power structures as well. There's a connection between the First Great Awakening and the American Revolution. And it's part of a larger trend of anti-authoritarianism that you're going to see in the American colonists. And anti-authoritarianism is part of Americanization. We will first talk about Anglicization, how it began, how it looked, and how it contributed to the casus belli for the American Revolutionary War. In the beginning, the English colonists lived very simple lives. What some scholars think was a system that was a medieval social structure transplanted to North America. This near-medieval social system was particularly evident in colonial Virginia, pre-Bacon's Rebellion. Colonists lived in simple, one-room, wattle and daub houses with thatched roofs, similar to the rural peasantry of Europe. The living model of these homes was communal as well, with a single room and storage loft being shared by all residents. As you remember, indentured servants, mostly white in the beginning, made up the colony's labor force, and they were bound and subservient to their masters, much like medieval serfs, although they lived in much closer proximity to their masters than the serfs did. They lived together in small, communal homes. Masters, like medieval lords, ruled over their peasants, and they were expected to take care of them as well, although this often did not happen, and indentured servants were usually treated poorly. Free colonists were also expected to be subservient to the landed gentry, just like the indentured servants. The gentry would host feasts, athletic competitions, horse races, and blood sports to entertain the free colonists, both those born in America and those who had survived their indentures to earn freedom. Scholars call this sort of social arrangement noblesse oblige, where the elite is expected to paternalistically take care of those beneath them. In exchange, the colonists were expected to obey the gentry's laws, serve in their militias, and vote for them in elections. Scholars call this communal paternal system the convivial community as well. This convivial arrangement was intended to keep the colonial poor from rising against the elite in order to prevent populist insurrections like Bacon's Rebellion. This convivial community would continue after the growth of plantation slavery and the establishment of slave societies in the southern colonies, from Maryland down to Georgia. This type of system existed in the North as well, but was much weaker, as the New England colonies were more democratic and the colonial wealth was more evenly divided between the common people and the elite. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, technological developments and political changes caused the Anglo-American colonies to begin the trend of Anglicization, as they felt more of a connection with the British Empire, particularly the monarchy. Many of the early colonists, especially in New England, had fled the British Isles because they did not like the King of England. But the monarchs of the late 1600s and early 1700s were fiercely Protestant, so the colonists felt that they could trust them. During this period, technological changes in the British Isles made Britain more industrial, allowing the British to export consumer goods to the American colonies, where they could be sold at a much higher profit. In response, the colonists purchased a variety of consumer goods: glassware, ceramic dinnerware, flatware, tea sets, and tobacco boxes, even decks of cards, which bore the symbols of Britain and its royalty. The colonists also purchased consumable goods like tea, coffee, and sugar, which, because they could not be produced in the North American colonies, reminded Anglo-Americans that they were part of the larger British Empire, ruled over by the king in London. The British Empire had embargo laws, which forbade colonists from purchasing certain goods from Britain's imperial rivals, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. Nonetheless, the colonists often broke these laws, and the British Admiralty enforced the embargoes haphazardly in an arrangement that scholars have called benign neglect. Benign neglect essentially allowed the Anglo-American colonists to have their cake and eat it too when it came to their relations with the British Empire. The colonists had the freedom to control their own political and economic affairs while skirting British trade embargoes. At the same time, the colonists had a ready market for raw material commodities, fur, indigo, rice, and tobacco. And they also enjoyed the maritime protection that the British Navy afforded the colonial shipping. In the years following the French and Indian War, the British Empire would do more to enforce these embargoes, while also levying taxes on the imported goods on which the colonists had come to depend. On the subject of dependent, these consumer items were much more common in the households of the coastal urban centers like Boston, New York City, and Charleston than they were in the frontier backcountry. While frontiersmen were able to purchase these goods at country stores, they tended to be more expensive in the interior than they were on the coast, due to the cost associated with transporting them over land. Consequently, frontier colonists were more likely to shun imported British consumer goods because of their price. Frontiersmen also began to associate consumption of imported goods with physical weakness and the effete culture of the cities. For example, colonial frontiersmen abjured the drinking of tea and coffee, popular beverages with the coastal elite, which also had to be imported. Frontiersmen believed that only weak, sick men drank coffee or tea. Instead, frontiersmen drank alcohol, including American-made hard cider and corn whiskey, especially at breakfast, to demonstrate their own rural culture. Even as the American colonists were being more drawn into the Atlantic world of trade, which was anglicizing their culture, the colonists were also developing their own new and unique beliefs and life ways, which contrasted them with their counterparts in Britain. While religion was important to most 18th century Europeans, it was far more important to colonial Americans. Some of the American colonies, especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic regions, had been founded specifically for religious reasons. Even though theocratic governance was on the decline in the American colonies by the 18th century, religiosity was on the rise as evangelical Christian sects like the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Wesleyans grew in numbers and influence, especially on the frontier. These new religious sects openly questioned the hegemony of the established Puritan and Anglican elite, and in doing so, they also threatened the authority of the British monarchy as well. If God, the creator of the universe, did not have the final say in a person's spiritual destiny, as the First Great Awakening reformers taught, how could any mere man, even a king, rule over other humans? European visitors to the American colonies, especially British soldiers, were both shocked and uneasy about the religious fervor of everyday American colonists, in contrast to their own people back in Britain. Some even remarked that the colonists' revolutionary, patriot sentiment would not even exist if it were not for the goading and incitement of their religious preachers. To highlight the religiosity of the colonists, consider that during the American Revolutionary War, American troops disinterred the remains of George Whitefield, the famous preacher of the First Great Awakening, in 1775. By the way, we discussed Whitefield in a previous lecture. Although he'd been dead for 5 years, the soldiers took pieces of Whitefield's burial clothes and pinned the relics to their coats, hoping that the divine spirit that inspired Whitefield would protect them in battle. The colonial lower classes rejected Puritanism and Anglicanism, and at the same time, the colony's elite people questioned old religious systems as well. Unlike the lower classes, who embraced fiery evangelicalism, wealthy Americans instead adopted the ideals of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a European philosophical movement that emphasized education, science, and rationalism. Inspired by the Reformation of the 16th century, Enlightenment scholars like John Locke, Baron Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that humans had certain unalienable rights that good political leaders were bound to respect, since legitimate governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, rather than divine right or brute force. Unlike the Reformation, which called for a return to Orthodox Christian principles, followers of the Enlightenment questioned core Christian beliefs. For example, many children of the Enlightenment, including some founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were deists. Deists believed in a God, a divine being or creator, but they did not think that God intervened in the affairs of humanity. Deists also denied key biblical miracles, like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but they still respected Christian moral principles. Upper-class Americans questioned the legitimacy of British government through their criticism of religion, while lower-class Americans repudiated Britain through their increased religiosity. The colonists also lived far better and had a higher standard of living than their European counterparts. The colonists had more and better food to eat, especially meat. The typical diet of a European commoner in the 18th century consisted of bread and grain porridge, called pottage. They consumed their bread and pottage with root vegetables, like turnips, onions, and carrots, and potatoes introduced from the Americas. More well-off peasants might add the occasional chicken egg or dairy product to this meager diet. The peasants rarely ate meat, typically consuming it only during holidays and feast days. Americans also ate porridges and root vegetables, but they ate a lot more meat, both from wild game and domesticated animals. The colonists' varied diet has been confirmed by archaeologists, who have discovered and investigated their trash piles, called middens, and their outhouse toilets, called privies or necessaries. Archaeologists have found bones and faunal material in these depositories, leading them to see how varied the colonial American diet actually was. European observers were shocked to see that American colonists, even the poor, tended to be several inches taller than their counterparts back in Europe. As the 17th century wore into the 18th century, the colonists rejected their initial small one-room wattle and daub houses and instead began to build larger domiciles with added separate bedrooms and outbuildings, as shown by the floor plans of colonial homes and archaeological digs completed on the colonists' long-lost homesteads. The colonists had come to favor larger homes with separate bedrooms due to rising trends of individualism and privacy. The colonists, especially those of the nascent middle class, believed that it was important to separate sleeping and common areas. Religious colonists, like the wealthy Quakers of Pennsylvania, even went so far as to make sure that each of their children had their own private bedrooms, where they could explore their inner light in peace. Religious colonists were also beginning to believe that sex and physical intimacy needed to be more private, as adults began to build master bedrooms where they could have privacy from their children and servants or slaves. The colonists also began to build large but ornate chests in which they stored their clothing, primarily undergarments, their unmentionables. This belief in individualism and privacy, core American values, would also undermine the colonists' loyalty to the mother country, as they began to think of themselves as their own people, not subject to a king or parliament across the Atlantic Ocean. Developments like Americanization, which saw the American colonists begin to live their lives in ways that were different from their counterparts in Europe, combined simultaneously with the colonists' higher standard of living and taste for imported British goods, Anglicization. Both of these trends actually caused friction between the settlers and their mother country. As we discussed previously, the British Empire, in the wake of the French and Indian War, began to retire their benign neglect relationship with the American colonists. The British Parliament wanted the colonists to shoulder the financial costs of the war, a conflict they believed the colonists had caused. Although the war had been a massive victory for Britain, it was very expensive, costing about £50 million, almost doubling the British national debt at the time. To this end, Parliament called for taxes to be levied on goods the colonists imported from Britain. Parliament also called for the strengthening and increased enforcement of the old embargoes to make sure that the colonists did not just buy foreign, untaxed goods. Apprehended blockade runners were to be tried in British Admiralty courts rather than receive jury trials in the colonies, because the juries tended to side with the defendants rather than the British prosecution. The British put taxes on a variety of goods, including paper and eventually tea, both of which were becoming essential parts of anglicized and Americanized colonial life. It should be noted, though, that the British also lowered taxes on some items, like sugar, with the hope that the colonists would legally purchase these goods, ideally from British colonies in the Caribbean, rather than buying them illegally from foreign smugglers. This lowering of taxes hurt the smugglers' revenue. Smuggling had become a major industry in the colonies, leading to contrabandists like John Hancock joining the Patriots. To make matters worse, the colonists could not pay these taxes using printed paper money. They had to pay with British currency, which was all the more difficult since the colonies were experiencing a recession at the end of the French and Indian War. British paper that had properly been taxed bore a stamp, signaling that the purchaser had paid the import duty to the British government. The stamp tax, with its symbol of imperial power and regulation, the British crown, became a rallying point for the colonists against the mother country. The colonists convened a Stamp Act Congress in 1765 in which they petitioned the British government for the removal of the odious stamp tax. They also called for their own representation in Parliament. The British government responded that the colonists did not need representatives on the floor of Parliament. As colonists, they had virtual representation in the person of the British monarch, in this case, King George III, who had ascended the throne in 1760 during the French and Indian War. While elite colonists met in congresses to peacefully petition the government, lower-class colonists reverted to more violent means of tax revolt, including the burning of effigies in imperial bureaucrats, the ransacking of British officials' homes, and in some cases, assaults against tax collectors and custom agents, including the use of tarring and feathering. Colonial leaders, while they disavowed this violence, had a long tradition of tolerating mobs like these, believing that the lower classes' riots, quote-unquote out of doors as they were called, acted as a pressure release, preventing the colonies from falling into full-scale revolt and anarchy, as seen during Bacon's Rebellion, which we have discussed before. Before we continue our discussion of how the American colonists resisted British tax acts, I want to mention the Sugar Act, which was a type of excise tax passed in 1764. The Sugar Act of 1764 was actually a modification of the 1733 Molasses Act, which taxed non-British, foreign imported molasses at 6 pence per gallon. This non-British molasses came from the French, Spanish, and the Portuguese Caribbean colonies. It was a lot cheaper than British sugar and molasses from places like, say, Jamaica or Barbados. And the American colonists, looking for a good deal, preferred to buy the cheaper non-British molasses. The British government, of course, wanted to increase their own sugar and molasses production, so they passed this 6 pence per gallon tax on non-British molasses and sugar products. And molasses and sugar are very important to the American colonists, not only because they can be used to make rum, but sugar is a sweetener, and sugar is, of course, very addictive as well, as I've mentioned previously. And the colonists generally avoided paying this tax by just buying their sugar and molasses illegally. They would smuggle it from French and Spanish and Portuguese colonies. They would skirt the British regulators and not pay any taxes at all. Some also bought British-made molasses and sugar, which was more expensive. So basically, the 1733 Molasses Act didn't really work. It was too aggressive. The tax was too high. So the American colonists just smuggled goods instead. The 1764 Act actually lowered the tax on non-British sugar to 3 pence per gallon, cut it in half, with the hope that the American colonists would stop their smuggling and would just pay the tax, the lowered tax. At the same time, the Sugar Act also called for increased enforcement of laws against smuggling of non-British sugar. Smugglers who skirted the taxes, illegally importing these goods without the proper duties, instead of being tried in the colonies by a jury of their peers, they would instead be tried in admiralty courts. And these admiralty courts usually were in Nova Scotia, Canada, and there was usually no jury in the admiralty court. It's almost like a military court. And this was because these colonial courts usually acquitted the smugglers, because the smugglers were members of their community and the smugglers provided inexpensive goods. So the tax was lowered, but the fact that smugglers lost their right to a trial by jury angered American colonists. They felt that their rights as British subjects to a trial by jury were being threatened, which they in many ways were being threatened. Also, the idea behind the tax was to increase revenue. The 1733 Act had been much more about protecting British sugar production, but the 1764 Act was much more about raising revenue. And the idea was the revenue from this tax would help pay for the French and Indian War, which was very costly, and which many British politicians believe was the fault of the American colonists. But it would also fund a 10,000 strong British standing army in the American colonies. And this army was supposed to protect the colonies, but over time, Americans were really becoming to hate the British Army's presence in their colonies. They felt it was a violation of their rights as well. Every bit as much as losing the right to a trial by jury was. So naturally, they opposed the Sugar Act, not just because they don't want to pay the tax, but because they want to protect their rights. The most effective way that the colonists resisted the Stamp Act, though, was through non-importation, or the boycott of British goods. As a result of these acts of resistance in the colonies, along with petitions from British merchants whose export revenue had been lowered by the taxes and the boycotts, the hated Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 to relief on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. In exchange, Parliament issued the Declaratory Act, which stated the colonies were bound to follow future parliamentary laws, even though they still had no real representation in Parliament. Now I want to mention the political situation in the British Isles and how it affected the American colonists' fight against taxes and fight against the British government's attempt to control the colonies. At this time, there's two British, what I would call proto-political parties. They're not quite organized enough to really be political parties in the modern sense of the word. And these are the Whigs and the Tories. The Americans could not vote for members of Parliament, but they did find common cause with the British proto-political party called the Whigs. The Whigs tended to be urban people, dissenting Protestants, people who were not members of the Anglican Church, or they tended to be people who were influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment as well. It's an interesting group, religiously speaking. Economically speaking, the Whigs tended to be middle class or self-made businessmen, people who had become wealthy through their business acumen, through their trade deals, rather than because they were part of the nobility. There were some nobles that were in the Whig political faction, but early on, it's definitely much more of a middle class party. And these Whig businessmen, they made their money often by trading with the colonies. And when there's taxes put on British goods, being sold by the British to the colonies, that hurts their business because the American colonists will buy less of taxed goods. They don't buy taxed goods to the same degree. And in some cases, of course, the colonists made boycotts. They stopped importing British goods. This really hurt the bottom line of the Whigs. The Whigs were supporters of free trade. They wanted to be able to sell as much as they could to the American colonies so that they could make money. And of course, the Whigs, as a sort of political faction, had been around since the late 1670s. British people who supported the taxes and legislation related to these taxes tended to be from the Tory political party or political faction. Religiously speaking, the Tories tended to be Anglican or in some cases Catholic. They tended to be rural people. They tended to be landed gentry, members of the nobility. There were poorer people who supported the Tories as well, but they tended to be more rural people. And there were a lot of military officers who were Tories as well. And the military officers who were Tories saw these taxes as a way to fund the military and ensure that they basically had jobs. Remember, the British government wanted to keep at least 10,000 troops in the American colonies. This would ensure that these military officers would continue to have employment after the French and Indian War had ended. They did not want to have to enter civilian life. This is because the British laws did not allow for a standing army in Britain, but a standing army was possible in the colonies, even though the colonists were really coming to hate having the British army living in the colonies with them. So Tories tended to support these taxes because it was better for them financially. It helped the military. And the Whigs did not support these taxes because they were businessmen and the taxes hurt their business. And George III tended to lean more on the Tory side of things, but the Whigs were still a pretty important player in British politics well into the mid-1700s, and they will actually play a role in some of these taxes being repealed. With this background information about British politics, we'll continue our discussion of the taxes that the British government is passing against the American colonies. Although the Stamp Act had been a debacle for the British government, Parliament instituted a series of new taxes called the Townshend Acts of 1767. Named after British tax official Charles Townshend, the Townshend Acts taxed a variety of goods, including paint, glass, and tea. All three of these goods were essential for both the Anglicization and Americanization of the American colonies. Paint and glass were necessary for the construction and adornment of the expanding American homes. And tea, with its accompanying service rituals, helped colonists feel genteel and connected to the British Empire. The revenue from these taxes was earmarked to the enforcement of embargo laws and to garrison additional British troops in the American colonies, two things the colonists detested. In response to the indignities of the Townshend Acts, the colonists once again boycotted British goods and came together to condemn the legitimacy of taxation without representation. Early colonial leaders like John Dickinson, author of the anonymous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, declared that non-resistance to these taxes was a tacit consent to them, and that the taxes could only be made illegitimate through colonial resistance. Benjamin Franklin wrote that tax revenue generated in the colonies ought to go to government services and projects that the American colonists actually supported, not things they imposed, like embargo enforcement or British troop garrisons. As was the case with the Stamp Act, British exports to the colonies declined steeply, and all of the Townshend Acts, except for the duty on tea, were repealed in 1770. 1770 was also an important year as it saw the Boston Massacre, an important, if small, violent interaction between the British military and American colonists. The British government, since 1765 and the Stamp Act, had increased its garrisons of troops in the American colonies, centering their deployment on major coastal urban centers like Boston. Boston was the site of a lot of smuggling, so it was natural that the troops were deployed there. The troops' deployment in Boston angered Bostonians from a variety of backgrounds. Obviously, the smugglers hated having the troops stationed in their city, but everyday middle-class Bostonians did not like having the troops in their city, as they were billeted or quartered in the colonists' barns, stables, and taverns, and also on shared spaces like the Boston Common or Town Square. What is more, in an age before credit cards, British troops did not always pay for their bills or goods or services on time when they did business with colonial merchants. Lower-class colonists also chafed under the British occupation as well. The underpaid British soldiers sought odd jobs during their liberty hours, driving down wages for working-class Bostonians, who were already feeling the squeeze of the economic slowdown that came as a result of the boycotts. Poor men and women rioted frequently in colonial America, and while the colonial elite often looked the other way during these riots, the same could not be said for the British Army. On March 5, 1770, an angry mob was harassing a squadron of British troops, pelting the soldiers with snowballs, rocks, and sharp oyster shells. The crowd grew quickly, soon including at least 300 rioters. The squad's leader, Captain William Preston, ordered the angry crowd to disperse, while commanding his men to load their muskets and assume a defensive position. The crowd continued to assault the soldiers, daring them to fire their muskets. Then the troops attacked the crowd, firing into them and killing 5 of the rioters, wounding 3 more. Among the killed was Crispus Attucks, an African American. Scholars consider Attucks to be the first American killed during the Revolution, as well as the first African American killed during the Revolution, even if full-scale combat between Britain and the colonies would not begin for another 5 years. The British troops were arrested, and rather than being court-martialed in Britain by a military tribunal, they were put on trial in a civilian court in Boston. While the city was divided between patriots and loyalists, many expected the soldiers would not receive a fair trial and would be executed for killing the rioters in self-defense. As an aside, the patriots often referred to themselves as Whigs, after the British political party that supported their anti-tax stance. Loyalists were often known as Tories because the Tory party took a harder line against the colonies. Many patriots/Whigs believed that it was important that the soldiers receive a fair trial, as convicting them in a biased, kangaroo-style court would damage their movement and transform the convicted soldiers into martyrs for the loyalists/Tories. The soldiers' defense was a local lawyer named John Adams, a patriot leader and eventually the second president of the United States. Though he was a patriot, Adams defended the soldiers using both skilled legal techniques and racist invective. For example, Adams decried the mob as being made up of dangerous black men like Attucks and unruly Irishmen and sailors. While we might not appreciate Adams' racist rhetoric, we can admire his commitment to helping his clients that he would have opposed in order to get a fair day in court. Adams' arguments worked, and 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted of murder, although 2 were convicted of manslaughter, for which they had their thumbs branded. The Boston Massacre was a significant event in the American Revolution and the colony's path towards war with Great Britain. It was the first case of British troops spilling American blood, but it also showed the organization of the American patriots who, though angry at the killing of their people by the soldiers, realized that they must not betray their principles in the name of revenge. Years later, John Adams declared the American Revolution truly began on March 5, 1770. As an aside, 4 of the rioters were tried in Boston for their role in fomenting the mob, but all were acquitted. Things were relatively quiet in 1771, but in 1772 and 1773, relations between the British Empire and the American colonists would become more strained and destructive. On June 9, 1772, the British customs schooner HMS Gaspee ran aground off the coast of Rhode Island. The schooner had been pursuing an American smuggler, the Hannah. Trapped in the shallow water, the Gaspee was not able to escape an angry mob of Americans from Providence, who came aboard the vessel, subdued the crew, burnt the ship, and shot the vessel's skipper, although he did survive his wound. In response, the British apprehended and tried the men who burned the Gaspee, but they were unable to convict them due to a lack of evidence they had captured the real conspirators. 1773 saw an even more contentious destruction of British property, the Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, Bostonian patriots who were members of the Sons of Liberty, an anti-British secret society, boarded 2 British vessels in Boston Harbor. The vessels were called the Beaver and the Dartmouth, and they threw the vessel's cargo of tea overboard. Tea had been a taxed good since 1767 under the Townshend Act, but the British government's grant of tea importation rights to the massive East India Company threatened the already strained business of colonial shippers and smugglers. In other colonies, the colonists had prevented the unloading of British tea, but Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a committed Tory, was determined to see the tea unloaded and sold. Something had to be done to keep the boycott going. In response, the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, brother of John Adams, planned to destroy the tea in Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty men boarded the British vessels under cover of darkness and disguised as Mohawk Indians. Then they threw the tea into Boston Harbor. The colonists' choice to disguise themselves as Native Americans is significant. First, it allowed the Sons of Liberty men to hide their identities, since their destruction of the tea was an illegal act. Second, it gave the Patriot conspirators a tangible way to signal that they were no longer British subjects, but true Americans, just like the continent's indigenous people. The colonists threw the tea into the harbor, destroying about 92,000 pounds by weight, valued at 10,000 British pounds, almost $2 million US today. Unlike the Gaspee raiders, the Boston conspirators were disciplined in their attack, avoiding violence against the ship's crews. They even made sure to sweep the decks to make sure that all the tea had been destroyed, and they also verified that none of their men stole any of the tea for themselves. The Boston Tea Party was a contentious and polarizing event in colonial British relations. While many Patriot colonists supported the destruction of the tea, others thought the Sons of Liberty had gone too far. Across the pond, British politicians who had previously been sympathetic to the plight of the American colonists were angered by the act, and in response took a harder line against the colonies. The British government in response to the Boston Tea Party, passed a series of retaliatory legislations called the Coercive Acts in 1774. The Coercive Acts, which came to be known as the Intolerable Acts, in America did three things. First, the acts revoked Massachusetts' colonial charter, effectively taking away the colony's home rule. This revocation alarmed the people of all 13 colonies, who realized that if Massachusetts could lose its charter, then so could they. Second, the Intolerable Acts allowed Massachusetts governor, the loyalist Thomas Hutchinson, to send British defendants back to England for trial, meaning the jury would be British instead of American. American smugglers had previously been sent back to Britain to be tried in admiralty courts, but the Intolerable Acts conversely allowed British defendants to be tried back in Britain, where they would be acquitted, undermining the colonial justice system, which had actually worked pretty well during the Boston Massacre of 1770. The final thing the Intolerable Acts did was including a provision called the Quartering Act, which allowed British Army officers to requisition colonial property, including private homes, for the building of British troops, although the troops were generally garrisoned in unoccupied buildings, like barns or warehouses, rather than inhabited domiciles. The Quartering Act applied to all colonies, not just Massachusetts. At the same time of the Intolerable Acts, Britain also passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which mandated the Ohio country belong to the Catholic, French-speaking province of Quebec, rather than the English colonies. The Quebec Act angered American frontiersmen who wanted to settle in the Ohio country but did not want to live under the rule of the Quebecois. Britain's coercive acts were intended to crush colonial resistance, but instead they did the opposite, bringing the colonies together against British rule. In response to the acts, the colonies formed committees of correspondence, which sent delegates to a council called the First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26th, 1774. Every colony except Georgia, which had a higher loyalist population, sent delegates. The delegates disagreed over how they should respond to the Intolerable Acts. More cautious attendees, like John Dickinson, whom we discussed earlier, urged that the delegates work within the British governmental system to redress their grievances. More radical attendees, like John Adams and Patrick Henry of Virginia, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," disagreed, considering armed struggle instead. In the end, the Congress compromised and called for a colonies-wide trade embargo on all British trade, including the importation of enslaved Africans. The First Continental Congress issued a series of statements about the nature of the American colonies' relationship with Britain. The Congress declared that the American colonists were still British subjects, and thus had a right to certain resolves, including life, liberty, and property, as well as representation in the British government. The colonies also should not be bound by any unique laws that did not affect the people of Britain, like the garrisoning of troops and colonial property during peacetime. In the end, the First Continental Congress did not call for separation from Great Britain, but their Declaration of Resolves would later inspire independence calls, like the 1776 Declaration of Independence. The First Continental Congress, which was intended to offer a compromise and seek peace with Britain, actually did the opposite. The Congress's demands hardened the British government, in particular King George III, the colonists' virtual representative. It turned his opinion against the colonies. The Congress also further galvanized the American colonies, whose citizens realized the British government, in particular the king, would not peacefully give up their demands. While patriot sentiment grew, especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic, loyalism remained popular in the newer Deep South colonies like Georgia and South Carolina. In the end, it was not one single event in the 1760s and early 1770s that moved the Anglo-American colonies to war with Great Britain. Rather, it was a series of cultural changes that created differences between Britain and the colonists. The colonists opposed the taxes the British government levied on key goods that they regularly imported, items that Anglo-Americans had come to depend on in their movements of Anglicization and Americanization. The colonists resented this taxation without representation and organized boycotts and congresses that called for the repeal of these taxes. The colonists also chafed under the changes the British government was making to its relationship with the colonies. Parliament and the king wanted to centralize and integrate the colonies and make them pay their fair share for their role in starting the costly French and Indian War. To this end, the British government deployed troops in the colonies to keep the colonists in line. The colonists resented the deployment of the British troops, particularly their quartering on private property. The friction between the colonists and troops helped to inspire the Boston Massacre of 1770, which created the first martyrs for the colonial independence cause. Later events, like the Boston Tea Party of 1773, caused the British government to take an even harsher stance against the colonists by undermining their colonial charters. The British government also prevented Western expansion on the frontier and increased the quartering of British troops on colonial property. The colonial elite tried to make peace with Britain at the Continental Congress of 1774, but their efforts for unification only drove the colonies and the mother country further apart. War was on the horizon. We'll discuss the armed conflict between Great Britain and the American colonies in future videos.